Hey everyone, and welcome back. What if the map of North America changed? What if some U.S. states, facing deep divisions and looking for a different path, actually considered joining their northern neighbor? It sounds wild, but today we're exploring why it's not as far-fetched as you might think. We're diving into the compelling and perhaps controversial question: states that might want to join Canada. Forget simple border disputes. We're talking about profound frustrations, shared values, and unique circumstances that could theoretically push American regions toward a Canadian future. Get ready for a thought experiment that reveals a lot about the U.S. itself. Before we identify specific states, it's crucial to acknowledge that the U.S. and Canada, despite their distinct national identities, share an incredible amount of common ground. They boast the longest undefended border in the world, a testament to a unique, largely peaceful relationship. For centuries, people, goods, and ideas have flowed freely across this line. We share a continent, a significant portion of our cultural heritage, and often even similar regional accents along the borderlands. In the past, there have been historical oddities and movements. After the American Revolution, some loyalists fled north to what became Canada, establishing communities that retained strong British ties. Conversely, during the American Civil War, some in Canada feared U.S. expansionism, while others sympathized with the Union. Even in the modern era, you occasionally hear lighthearted, or sometimes serious, suggestions, particularly from Americans frustrated with U.S. politics, about moving to Canada. This isn't a new thought. It's a dormant, almost mythical, undercurrent in the cross-border consciousness. But why would a sovereign U.S. state, with all its inherent ties to the American federal system, ever genuinely consider such a drastic move? It's a question that brings us to the core motivators. The United States is arguably more politically divided than it has been in decades. The stark contrast between red and blue states, the bitter partisan gridlock in Washington, D.C., and a perceived inability to address fundamental issues like climate change or healthcare effectively, leave many Americans deeply frustrated. For those who identify as politically progressive or even moderately centrist, the Canadian parliamentary system, with its often more consensual politics and less frequent governmental shutdowns, might appear more functional and less prone to ideological stalemates. A state tired of the constant political warfare might see Canada as a calmer, more pragmatic political environment. This is perhaps one of the most significant wedges. Canada's social policies often align more closely with the progressive values held by many Americans, particularly in specific regions. Asterisk healthcare, Canada's universal, single-payer healthcare system, is a huge draw. For many Americans, frustrated by the complexities, costs, and inequities of the U.S. private healthcare system, the Canadian model of healthcare as a right, not a privilege, is incredibly appealing. Asterisk gun control. Canada has significantly stricter gun control laws than the United States. In the wake of repeated mass shootings in the U.S., many Americans yearn for stronger regulations. States with populations that strongly favor stricter gun laws might find Canada's approach more aligned with their desire for public safety. Asterisk social safety nets. Canada generally has more robust social safety nets, including more comprehensive unemployment benefits, paternity/maternity leave, and childcare support. For populations that prioritize social equity and collective well-being, the Canadian social contract might be more attractive. Asterisk environmental policy. Canada, despite its resource industries, often presents itself as more proactive on climate change and environmental protection, aligning with environmentally conscious populations in certain U.S. states. While the U.S. economy is larger, Canada is often seen as having a more stable and less volatile economic landscape. The Canadian banking system, for example, is widely considered more conservative and resilient. For states struggling with economic uncertainty or those whose economies might better integrate with Canada's, the appeal could be economic. Furthermore, Canada's lower income inequality relative to the U.S. might suggest a fairer distribution of economic benefits, which could resonate with populations concerned about wealth disparities. This is less tangible but equally powerful. There's a persistent stereotype, often rooted in truth, of Canadians being nicer, more polite, and having a more collective societal ethos. For Americans who feel exhausted by the aggressive individualism, sharp political rhetoric, and sometimes divisive nature of U.S. society, the perceived calmness, civility, and communal spirit of Canada could be a significant draw. It's about a desire for a different social atmosphere. This is a practical but vital point. Any state considering such a move would logically need to be a border state. These states already have established cross-border communities, trade routes, cultural exchanges, and a familiarity with Canadian ways of life. For instance, residents of border cities often travel regularly between the two countries for work, shopping, or leisure, fostering a natural affinity. Now, let's turn our attention to specific U.S. states that, based on these factors, might theoretically entertain the idea of joining Canada. This is where the thought experiment gets really interesting. Both Washington and Oregon share a direct border with British Columbia, one of Canada's most vibrant and progressive provinces. Culturally, cities like Seattle and Portland often feel more aligned with Vancouver than with many parts of the American South or Midwest. These states are deeply progressive, with strong environmental movements and a high emphasis on social justice. Their populations often express frustration with U.S. federal policies on gun control, healthcare, and climate change, finding Canadian approaches more appealing. Economically, their tech and resource industries already have significant ties to British Columbia. For a Washingtonian, the idea of having universal healthcare and stricter gun laws like those in BC could be highly attractive, combined with easy access to Vancouver's cultural amenities. The Cascadia identity, a regional consciousness that transcends the U.S.-Canada border, already exists, envisioning a future united by shared environmental values and economic ties rather than national allegiance. Nestled close to Quebec and the Maritime provinces, Vermont and Maine are perhaps the U.S. states where this idea finds the most historical and cultural resonance. Vermont, in particular, is one of the most liberal states in the U.S., with a strong independent spirit and a long-standing emphasis on environmental protection and community. Its residents often express frustration with the pace of U.S. political change. They share a similar climate, rural character, and a kind of understated progressive pragmatism with their Canadian neighbors. Maine, with its vast wilderness and reliance on natural resources, also shares much in common with Atlantic Canada. The idea of adopting Canada's single-payer healthcare system or its approach to social welfare often appeals deeply to these populations, who feel increasingly out of step with mainstream U.S. politics. The close-knit border communities already live a life intertwined with Canada. Geographically, Alaska is an anomaly within the U.S. mainland. It doesn't share a direct border with the lower 48 states, but it shares a massive, intricate border with Canada. Its economic ties to British Columbia and Yukon are often stronger and more direct than to the rest of the U.S. The state also experiences a unique relationship with federal oversight, especially concerning resource management and Indigenous rights, where Canadian approaches might appear more aligned with local needs or desires. While politically often conservative, some Alaskans feel a sense of detachment for Washington, D.C., and might see greater logistical and even economic benefit from aligning with a contiguous nation that could provide easier access to markets and infrastructure. The sense of a frontier, identity, and rugged independence also has parallels in Canada's north. Minnesota is known for its strong progressive leanings, high social trust, and emphasis on public services, qualities often associated with Canada. Its residents might find Canada's healthcare system and social safety nets more appealing. Economically, there are strong trade ties across the border. Michigan, especially its economically diverse southern region, has deep historical and industrial ties to Ontario, particularly through the automotive industry. The Detroit-Windsor border is one of the busiest in North America. While Michigan can be a swing state, its large urban centers often share progressive values with Canadian cities. For many, the cultural and economic integration with Canada is already a daily reality. The shared environmental challenges of the Great Lakes also foster a collaborative spirit that transcends national lines. While often more conservative, North Dakota and Montana share long, often sparsely populated, borders with Canadian provinces like Saskatchewan and Alberta. Their economies are heavily reliant on agriculture, energy, and resource extraction, industries that have strong parallels in Canada. For residents of these states, the proximity to Canadian markets and existing trade infrastructure might be appealing. In times of U.S. federal policy shifts that impact their primary industries, a closer alignment with Canada's regulatory or economic frameworks could become a consideration. The shared rural values and cross-border family ties are also significant. It's important to note that any desire to join Canada would likely be concentrated in specific regions within these states, rather than a monolithic statewide consensus. For instance, the urban, progressive populations of Seattle or Portland might be more inclined towards Canada than the more conservative rural areas of Washington or Oregon. This highlights the internal divisions within U.S. states themselves, suggesting that even if a state considered such a move, it would likely face significant internal resistance from its own differing factions. While the idea is fascinating, the practicalities of a U.S. state joining Canada are monumentally complex and face almost insurmountable hurdles. This isn't just about drawing a new line on a map. It's about tearing apart and restitching centuries of legal, political, and cultural fabric. The U.S. Constitution does not provide a mechanism for a state to secede from a union. The Civil War established that states cannot unilaterally leave. A state joining Canada would effectively be an act of secession, which the U.S. federal government would almost certainly resist legally and potentially militarily. Countless treaties, international agreements, and domestic laws govern the relationship between the U.S. federal government and its states, as well as between the U.S. and Canada. Renegotiating these would be a diplomatic nightmare. While Canada's constitution provides paths for provinces to join or leave, incorporating a U.S. state would be unprecedented and likely require significant constitutional amendments and broad consensus across all existing Canadian provinces. No U.S. federal government, regardless of party, would willingly allow a state to leave and join a foreign power. This would be seen as a fundamental challenge to national sovereignty and territorial integrity. While pockets of interest might exist, the vast majority of Americans, even those critical of their government, identify strongly as American. The idea of changing citizenship, currency, legal systems, and national identity would be a bridge too far for most. Would Canada genuinely want to absorb a U.S. state? This would bring in a large population with potentially different political cultures, existing U.S. debt, and complex integration challenges. It could also severely strain Canada's relationship with its giant neighbor. It's also important to briefly consider Canada's side of this hypothetical scenario. While the idea might appeal to some Canadians due to a sense of expanded influence or the integration of like-minded populations, it would present an unprecedented challenge. On one hand, absorbing a progressive U.S. state might strengthen Canada's political identity and economic footprint. On the other, it would fundamentally alter the delicate balance of federal-provincial power, potentially reigniting internal debates about national unity, especially in Quebec. The integration costs, the potential for political instability, and the sheer scale of the undertaking would be immense. Canada values its stable, peaceful relationship with the U.S., and initiating such a move would shatter that foundation. So, while a fun thought experiment, the practical reality for Canada would likely be a resounding no. In conclusion, while the idea of a U.S. state joining Canada remains firmly in the realm of hypothetical thought experiments, it serves as a powerful barometer of discontent within the United States. The fact that this idea even surfaces speaks volumes about the challenges of political polarization, economic inequality, and social division facing the nation. It highlights a yearning among some populations for different approaches to healthcare, gun control, social welfare, and political discourse, approaches they perceive as more aligned with Canadian values. It underscores the profound regional differences within the U.S. itself, where some areas feel increasingly disconnected from the national mainstream. Ultimately, the thought of looking north isn't about a literal, imminent change of borders. It's a vivid symptom of a deeper conversation happening across America, about what it means to be American today, what core values the nation should uphold, and how to forge a path forward in an increasingly divided society. This fascination with the Canadian option is less about leaving the U.S. and more about a desire for change within North America itself. What are your thoughts on this fascinating hypothetical? Do you think the forces pulling certain regions towards Canada are stronger than we imagine? Share your perspectives in the comments below. If you found this deep dive intriguing, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more explorations of global trends and geopolitical questions. Thanks for watching.